welcome back to PA Chalk Up. I'm your host Manny, and today we have Tim. Hi Tim, how are we doing?
We're doing well, thank you.
Now, I will pre tell people this. We have previously filmed this. A fault on my end happened, and we weren't able to get it out. So Tim has been nice enough to come back on and talk about everything again. So appreciate you, Tim, for that as well.
Yeah, no worries, it happens. Technology is
But if
great
you,
until it doesn't work.
Exactly. Like the amount of times that I've had to have people come back on is crazy, but I still prefer this to Zoom or Teams. The time I spent on Zoom and Teams drove me nuts. So hopefully everything's good this time around. But if you let everyone know who you are, what you do, and how you got to where you are.
Sure. Currently an associate professor and the director of the Sports Science Master's Program at the University of Pittsburgh. Prior to coming to Pitt, so I've been here now a little over 3 months, about 3 months. And prior to this, I was at Carroll University in Waukesha, Wisconsin, a small liberal arts school, and I was there for 8 years. And I was the director of the sport physiology and performance coaching program there as well, and master's program. And variety of different things that we're doing right now is obviously combining strength and conditioning sports science within our masters. And obviously, the research that we've been doing recently has been very strength power oriented, so focused on things like weightlifting derivatives, those movements, as well as accentuated eccentric loading, eccentric training, and pretty much anything strength and power related we're interested in. And then obviously, with all the data that we collect here with our athletes, we're doing a lot of retrospective analyses with our graduate students on the athlete monitoring data that we're collecting. So a lot of force plate data, a lot of GPS data. There's a lot of things that we're going to be doing here.
As a strength coach and a business owner, my time is quite limited. My favorite part about being a coach is the fact that I get to interact with athletes and be with athletes and really coach them. That's why I use TeamBuildr. I remember the days of searching for exercises, manually typing them in, and spending hours on spreadsheets and organizing my programs. This tends to be quite tedious and a lot of time consuming, which meant that I wasn't able to coach as much. So now for my business, TeamBuildr is a non-negotiable. It's an all-in-one programming platform that lets you create and deliver workouts to your athletes just in a few clicks. With TeamBuildr, I can customize programs, track athletes' progress in real time, and generate performance reports. My athletes get full ownership of their progress and can even share feedback on how they felt the session's going. Having this in place actually gives me more time to coach and be with my athletes. If you're ready to take your next step in your programming, give more time to your athletes, head over to teambuildr.com and use promo code PAChalkup, that's PACHALQUP, and start your 30-day free trial. Perfect. And with the strength to power element of research that you do with the derivatives, what are some of the information that's came out from that, and how is it applicable to the field that you found a link to?
Well, I think we just made this podcast about 3 hours longer because that's about how long it's going to take for me to get through that.
Hey,
Um,
I've got
hey,
time for you, Tim. I've got all the time for you.
yeah, we've had so the process of the weightlifting derivatives kind of started. Paul Comfort was one of the first ones who was doing some of the pulling derivative research. So just for the listeners, there's weightlifting movements, which are going to be your snatch and clean and jerk, and then there's derivatives of those that are just modifications of the competition lifts. So we can break the clean and jerk into clean variations and jerk variations, but also what we would call overhead pressing derivatives, kind of stemming from the original pressing exercise. But then there's weightlifting catching derivatives that are going to modify either the starting position or the catching position. So, like a clean versus a power clean versus a mid thigh power clean or a hang clean. So, these are all catching variations. Obviously, you could add the snatch in front of the, or instead of clean and all of those. But then we have weightlifting pulling derivatives, which are going to omit the catch phase completely. So you have things like pulls from the floor, hang pulls, counter movement shrugs, jump shrugs, hang high pulls. And a lot of that stemmed from some of Paul's original studies. He was comparing a mid thigh pull with a mid thigh power clean, mid thigh clean, and then all of those were done at the same load. During my thesis project, this was during 2011, 2012, and then we started publishing that a little bit thereafter, was comparing the jump shrug, the hang high pull with the hang power clean across a spectrum of loads. So we kind of expanded on what Paul was doing, and then kind of looked um, how the load was going to, the exercise and load combination kind of modified the stimulus a little bit. Because we were looking at, distinct or instantaneous variables such as peak force, peak power, peak velocity, we expanded that out and then started looking at the overall force time curve itself to see if they were going to differ between the exercises and the loads. And we did find that when looking at a jump shrug compared to a hang high pull and a hang power clean, that the force time curve was very unique. The counter movement and everything was the same because they started from the same position, went down to the knee, transitioned back. But then the second pull phase, or in this case, the jump itself, showed a very peaked force time curve compared to the other two. And so this was followed up by research by Christoph Kipp. And basically, we found that 85% of the movement itself, when time normalized, were the same. They were really identical. But that last 10 to 15% was very unique in terms of the actual propulsion of that movement.
Mm-hmm.
So we then expanded upon that because we started looking at different exercises and things like that. And so Paul and I actually submitted a grant to the NSCA to actually do a training study. This was the International Collaboration Grant a while back that doesn't exist anymore. But the whole purpose of the study was to compare um, catching variations compared to training with pulling variations that were biomechanically similar. So this was 8 weeks of training. And so one group went through and did every single time they had a catching or a weightlifting movement, they would perform a catch phase. So it was a power clean from the floor or a mid thigh power clean. And this was two different blocks where they did sets of 5 or sets of 3. This was in season with some of the athletes that Paul had used, and then what we ended up finding was that there was both groups improved. So they improved their power output, their jump height, their isometric mid thigh pull, peak force, etc., their strength. Um, but there was no difference between the groups. So the take home message of that original research was that uh, it's not do one or the other. It's that you can do either and get a very similar training effect when the loads were identical. So that's a part that I missed just
Mm-hmm.
describing there. But um, the exercises, whether it's a power clean from the floor or a pull from the floor, were performed with the exact same load. So as a result, we kind of identified the gray area that kind of existed from a training stimulus standpoint, that it didn't matter what exercise and load combination we used, that you could use pulling variations and you could use catching variations and get the exact same training effect based on the metrics that we looked at. So because we have the potential with pulling derivatives to load beyond someone's 1RM clean or snatch because they're not catching the bar, but we can also introduce variations that have really light loads that we can get a max effort from and are a bit more ballistic in nature, like your jump shrug and hang high pull. We can either get higher forces due to heavier loads, or we can get higher velocities that we may not be able to achieve with catching variations. So if you can kind of think of it as an overload stimulus from the force and velocity end of the spectrum. So we expanded upon Paul's study, and I ran this study at Carroll, that we had three different groups. So group one and group two were very similar to Paul's study in that you had the same exact loading. One group did catching, one group did biomechanically similar pulling. But then we added a third group that, as I described, used phase specific loading so that we could emphasize either the force component or the velocity component, depending on the goals that the individual had. And what we ended up finding with that, so this was done 10 weeks of training, and just for context, both polling groups did not, these are all clean variations. Both polling groups did not catch for 10 weeks. They did not front squat for 10 weeks. The only time they were in a front rack position was when they were doing either like a push press or a jerk variation as
Mm.
part of their training program. And they also did, they were squatting, they were doing upper body movements, they were, you know, push pull, rowing variations, all of these things just to make it a very well-rounded and
Yeah,
ecologically
program.
valid program. So we measured everything you could possibly think of. So they did a 1 RM power clean prior to the study, post study. They did iso pulls. They did um, short sprints, 10, 20, and 30 meters. They did a 505 change of direction on both legs. They did squat jumps. They did counter movement jumps. I mean, with several different loads. So you name it, we measured it. We also looked at some muscle architecture in both the vastus lateralis as well as the biceps femoris muscle. What we ended up seeing cumulatively kind of across that is that the overload group, and I'm just going to use the 1RM power clean as an example, the overload group on average improved from a relative standpoint 8% over the course of 10 weeks.
Wow.
So, just for context, the catch group and the pulling group maybe improved about 4% on average. And there were some people within the pull and the overload group that actually decreased their performance. It wasn't by much, but they did decrease their performance. Um, for context, the heaviest loads that the overload group used were about 135% of their 1RM power clean during mid thigh pulls. And then the heaviest loads that the catch group did during their power cleans or hang cleans, I can't remember which exercise, I think it's power cleans, was 82.5% for five, which was very
Wow.
difficult. So, just for context, you can obviously improve your 1RM using submaximal loads, but you can improve it more when you can introduce super maximal loads that they may not have used previously. Now, I use that example because, just as a reminder, the individuals in that group and all groups did not front squat the entire time, and they didn't in the overload group and pull group didn't catch a clean for 10 weeks. So,
Mm.
and this was training 3 times a week. It just goes to show that you're training a similar movement, number one. But two, when you expose the individual to different positions and still performing that second pull movement, they can still improve their clean without actually cleaning.
Yeah. I really like that you measured every variable instead of controlling every variable. I think that says a lot to, again, I've met you and Paul, so I kind of know what use value in terms of research and then the application that you can get from it. So controlling a variable is very different from what you do, because like again, my biggest pet peeve in reading research is like when I go down to the methods section and they try and control or eliminate every variable that could happen in a performance setting. Can you sort of just guide us on your thought process behind that and why you've measured every, because like again, you have to account for all this data, you have to then analyze it and then make sense of it. So that's a lot of extra work. So why is that important as opposed to controlling it for you guys?
So, the other thing I'll mention about Paul's research and my research is these are non-weightlifters. So these are individuals who don't compete in weightlifting. They're more kind of your typical team sport type athlete or individual sport athlete that is going to be performing, change of direction movements. They're going to jump, they're going to sprint. So the idea was that we measured all these things because we want to see not only, if you train a movement, is it going to get better? They obviously used weightlifting movements. They got stronger, they squatted, they got stronger over the course of the study, which directly relates to weightlifting performance. But we wanted to see if the transfer
Mm,
of those movements actually move towards other skills. Now, we did not have them on a sprinting program. We did not have them on a change of direction program. So it was only resistance training 3 times a week. You could probably, maybe, you could possibly see even better improvements if you added those things into what we did, primarily due to the fact that they are using that skill specific strength, force production characteristics, and
mm,
actually sprinting, actually changing direction, because those things in itself are skills and they need to be practiced. So what we ended up finding was that, again, with the overload group, that we saw, you know people were jumping higher, but why were they jumping higher? So measuring these on a force plate, we could see that their propulsive force was a lot higher than it
mm,
was previously, due to the fact that they took the time within the training program to trained to generate a much larger impulse, so larger forces over a shorter period of time. We also saw that with the pull group, that was pretty unique. That we saw, higher velocities, because if you think about it, they're using submaximal loads basically the entire time with pulling derivatives. In comparison to the overload group. But we wanted to look at it to see primarily, and this is a long-winded answer to your question. I apologize.
it's all
Um,
good. Take your time.
we wanted to see if the improvements of someone's strength characteristics performing these movements, if it's going to transfer to other skills.
Yeah. So that's actually my next question is with the 8% increase in the the test that you did, how was that then sort of applied into their performance as an athlete?
Sure. Um, we basically show that you can improve dynamic strength, isometric strength, and from a skill standpoint, we're giving them the foundation of, if you want to run faster, we know that you can run faster just doing this. But it kind of laid the foundation and mentioning the fact that if we were to combine these with actual skill practice, that it's going to improve it even more. But we also, the general conclusions were, if you're going to use weightlifting movements in training, it's not saying only do pulls or
Mm,
only do or don't do catches. And I challenge anyone to read Paul's research or my research that says don't catch, because it doesn't say that. What it does say is that we should be using exercise and load combinations that are specific to the goals of each individual phase. Because there's a time and a place to catch, there's a time and a place to perform pulls based on what they're capable of doing. But it also says that if you don't want to catch, that's okay too, because you can get a
mm.
really good training stimulus.
Yeah, it all goes back to that macro, meso, micro cycle where you're obviously going to consider the different specific needs through like say a year long program. Like you'll need some strength, power, endurance, speed, COD in there, but then it's sort of like mixing and matching when those specific phases are required.
Right.
Yeah. And you kind of spoke about the overloading systems a little bit. And again, I'm going to put this video up because we have previously spoke about this. And it's like overloading the CNS in a way that's like instead of doing below 100 percent, you're doing like 110, 105, 120, and it's what are the benefits that you found behind that, and why is that important to do as well as your normal under 100%?
Yeah, I mean, now provided the fact that the individual is capable of doing it, we
Yep.
want to be able to stress the nervous system to kind of provide a stimulus that they may not have received or felt previously. So the purpose of that study, back 10 years ago now, was a potentiation study. So we wanted to see, following really heavy partial movements. So in this case, it was a half squat from a 90-degree knee angle off the pins. We wanted to see if that was going to transfer to a squat jump, a static jump from 90 degrees as well. And the reality is, from a potentiation standpoint, is, at least from what I've found, is that the movement needs to be very specific, one transferring to the other, but two, it should stress the nervous system to kind of recruit those higher end motor units that we may not necessarily have achieved previously, and then see if those can actually hang on to a subsequent task, or into a subsequent task. So in this case, this is what they were using. It was 90% for a double of
Mm.
their 1 RM half squat from the pins. So it was not light. It was very heavy. And actually, if we went through and actually did the calculations, it was still a super maximal load, compared to what their parallel squat was, for each individual. So as a result of that, um, they may walk out of there, and I ask them to do a squat jump within 15 seconds. Some of them are going to jump through the roof. Some of them are going to tank because their body isn't necessarily, that we generate both fatigue and potentiation on a spectrum. Their body may not be ready for it yet. But to your point, why do we want to use those things? It's because, we're trying to expand the loading spectrum for an individual, and we can't do that if we're always loading submaximally. There's some really good
Mm.
research out there to suggest that doing, full range of motion squats paired with partial squats would actually give you a better benefit than just doing full squats alone. Obviously, it has to be within a certain time period of the year. You're probably going to sacrifice some volume with the full squats so that you can use the partials as well. But yeah, it just exposes an individual to some, a training stimulus that they may not have felt or used before.
Yeah, so it's kind of going to that again, PAP, and it's that neural prep for what's to potentially come in future performances. And like off the end of that, we then have to talk about like the braking forces that happen. So that's when your eccentrics come into it, and you do a lot of research in eccentrics as well. How do you pair both, and like what has your research led to dabble in both of them?
Yeah, so a good chunk of our research right now is focused on accentuated eccentric loading. So for listeners, that is a movement that's going to pair, the eccentric and concentric movement, um, normal movement mechanics, but it also, what's unique about it is that you have a heavier load eccentrically than you do concentrically. Um, Now, that's typically done via weight releasers that would be on the outside of the barbell, but you may use dumbbells if you're holding on to them, and dropping them at the bottom of a counter movement jump or something like that. What we're finding, is we're doing several different things right now, but the first paper that we had out and the one that we have in review right now, used both men and women. We used traditional squats versus, maximally loaded AEL, which means their first repetition of the squat was performed with their 1 RM. But we also looked at super maximal with 110%. There are individuals that go on to like 120%. I'll tell you, like, you may be capable of doing that, but doing multiple sets of it is going to be really challenging, especially if you reload the hooks. But anyway, what we're finding is, we're comparing the differences between, how much load needs to come off, and um, can it be beneficial from the propulsion standpoint if, instead of just the braking phase. So both studies with men and women, what we found is that the braking phase was enhanced when you're using a heavier load, which isn't groundbreaking. But what we did also learn from it is that we perform the squats with 50, 60, 70, and 80% of their 1RM on the way up. So we're
Mm.
learning how much weight needs to fall off in order to get a certain training stimulus. And our conclusions were that a greater amount of weight that falls off, so let's just say 100% on the way down, 50 on the way up, will be a greater stimulus for rate of force development from the braking side of things, compared to if I had 100 on the way down and 80 on the way up is going to be more of a strength type stimulus, so more your peak force stimulus. Now, anyone who's ever done AEL will tell you that when only a little weight falls off, it's still very challenging. Um, and you don't need, like, we did sets that they did 110% on the way down and 80 on the way up, and it was only the first repetition that they used the hooks. But I'd tell you, by rep 3 of that set, it's hard. Um,
Mm.
but we found that with both the men and the women. I'm working on the third paper of that project, and what we did is similar to the potentiation stuff that we were talking about previously. Is not everybody has the same benefits from that. So stronger people versus weaker people may actually respond a little bit differently, because AEL is also um, has this idea of within set potentiation. So we use the first repetition to benefit the subsequent, concentric phase, and maybe the subsequent repetitions as well. The original work, the by John Waggle, a little is back during his dissertation, so like 2018, 19, 20, when he was publishing that. Um, what he ended up finding was that by using the hooks, the weight releasers on rep 1, it actually carries over into reps 2 and 3. Obviously, if you reload the hooks, you're going to get that eccentric stimulus each time. But even if you just use the hooks on rep 1, you can benefit reps 2 and 3.
Is that with the fatigue mechanism at play there?
It could be, it could be, again, I don't know. On average, that's what they saw, but I don't know that they did a comparison with stronger and weaker people to see
Mhm.
how it benefited them. But they ended up doing a kind of a rep by rep analysis, and were able to see that they did sets of 5. But first rep enhanced from eccentric rate of force development, reps 2 and 3, eccentric rate of force development still elevated. But by rep 4 and 5, it was back to baseline. So that
Mm.
has to do, I'm sure, with the fatigue that was accumulating throughout that set. I'm not surprised. It's kind of like any set that we do. You see a decrease in
Drop off, yeah.
velocity the more reps you do, like that type of thing. Um, but we followed up those studies with a comparison of the 3 different conditions. So traditional, maximal AEL, super maximal AEL, comparing between those who could squat double body weight for those that against those that couldn't. Um, and I think what we ended up with was the average squat of the stronger group was something like 2.2 or 2.3 times their body weight, versus the other group was like 1.7, which isn't weak by any means. It's just not, that level that we ended up doing a comparison with. What was really interesting about this, and I need to write faster so I can get this out, um, and need to stop doing other projects. But um, what we ended up finding is we looked at braking and propulsion, um, mean force, duration, and impulse of all those repetitions, the average, and across the loading spectrum of 50, 60, 70, 80. And we ended up finding that from a traditional squat standpoint, so no weight releasers, there was no difference in any variable except propulsion duration, where it was shorter with the stronger individuals, which basically means that the stronger individuals were able to perform the propulsion phase faster on average. Not surprising. Um, but no difference in braking, no difference in really propulsion. But what was interesting was that once we added in the weight releasers, then we started seeing significant differences in how they perform the braking phases across the loading spectrum. And with the super maximal loads as well, we also saw improvements in the propulsion phase in the stronger group, whereas the weaker group had really no change. So, as a take home, stronger individuals are able to use AEL to achieve a greater braking stimulus and then carry that over into the propulsion side of things with squats to a greater extent compared to weaker individuals. Now, that follows the research on typical potentiation, where stronger individuals get a better training stimulus. But this is primarily the reason why myself and others have classified AEL as very much an advanced training strategy. You know, we know that it can work, but we're still trying to answer a lot of questions of how to implement
Mm-hmm.
it. So myself, Chris Tabor, handful of others who are doing this type of research, that's ultimately the goal. It's how much load, what should the eccentric duration be, how frequently should we do it, who should use it? These are all different questions that need to be answered. So we're still kind of grazing the surface, to be honest.
Yeah. Can you just describe a little bit of AEL and what some descriptions of it is?
Sure. AEL, again, accentuated eccentric loading. I mentioned that there's three characteristics it has to have. The heavier load during the eccentric phase compared to the concentric, pairing eccentric and concentric muscle actions, but also using a minimal disruption to their natural movement mechanics. What's really unique about AEL is that you can use supermaximal loads that we were talking about. So in our case, 110%. You can use maximal loads, but you can also use submaximal loads, all the way down to low percentages of body weight. So some of the seminal studies, the first studies on submaximal stuff were done with jumps with Jeremy Shepard's work back in, I think, 2007, 2008. And he was doing AEL jumps, dumbbell jumps with, or jumps in general. I'm not sure if they were dumbbells or not, but with elite volleyball players. And what they ended up showing acutely and chronically is that they were able to improve their power output, jump height, explosive ability with individuals who need to be able to jump explosively.
Mm-hmm.
And the rest of the research since then has been very unique in that it's been looking at what percentage of their body weight is going to give like the best training stimulus. And a lot of people agree that's roughly about 20% of their body weight. We're doing a study right now. We're finishing data collection. I think we have all the men, but we're finishing up data collection with the women, looking at 10, 20, 30% body weight, as well as 10, 20, 30% of their back squat 1RM, which hasn't been used before. So um, we should be able to do a strength comparison with that as well. And I think I know what we're going to find with it. I think the listeners would know what we're going to find. But yeah, the different definitions is that we have AEL with submaximal loads really light. We have super maximal loads that can be really heavy. Um, what I will tell you AEL is not is AEL and flywheel are not the same thing. So flywheel training um, generally uses a closed system. Now we're talking about non-motorized flywheel, so not exerfly with the motor.
Mm-hmm.
But if we have an individual with their harness, they push up and they receive that stimulus coming down, that is a closed system. So the impulse you generate is the impulse you have to accept. That is not AEL. Now, another thing that is not AEL is it's related. I will say that, but what we call accelerated eccentrics, which were kind of coined by John Hughes, Matt Hanford, and Tommy Bright in the UK, that are accelerated eccentrics are those that are really trying to emphasize the speed of the braking phase. So using bands, for example, to do a counter movement jump. So bands are going to accelerate you down into that counter movement or the downward phase, the braking phase. So you're going to get a very peaked impulse during that braking phase, and it's all an accelerated eccentric is also going to be something like a drop catch. So holding on
Mhm.
to a hex bar and you accelerate downward and stop yourself before the weights would hit the floor. You can obviously do that with a bench press, even a squat, with lighter loads. But you can see that there's very much a spectrum of eccentrics. It's just a matter of you know how we classify them, and that's something that we're working on as well.
I've previously had the CEO of Eccentric on talking about, we were talking about how it started and the development of it. And something that I wasn't as aware of at the time was, obviously, as much as you put in is what you get out. Now, what he introduced to me at that point was that you can actually, so have you seen those lifts where people have the safety squat and they've got their hands on the rack and they're doing sort of like, um they're pushing themselves up to be able to overload the bar.
Hmm.
He's saying that he can, you can do that as well with the K box, and what you're pushing up is then what's going to get put down. So that would be more than like you are able to do yourself, if that makes sense.
Yeah, there was one paper that was published within the last couple years in Strength and Conditioning Journal that was talking about actually providing an overload. And now, in this case, overload is higher eccentric forces or other variables compared to concentric. Um, you're perfectly capable of doing that in the way that you described, but they also mentioned, performing the concentric phase with two limbs and then accepting it on one.
Mhm.
That's another method of
Okay.
eccentric training in general, just called a 2-1 method. They also talked about changing the range of motion. So if I do a full squat from the bottom and accelerate all the way upwards, and then I accept that external or the eccentric forces in a quarter squat, it's obviously going to be a very large impulse over a short period of time, making it very peaked. So they talked about that in that paper. And off the top of my head, I cannot remember who wrote it. Um, but yeah, it's a very unique paper
Mhm.
that I think when people talk about flywheel training, it's certainly you're certainly able to do it as long as you understand how to actually do
Mhm.
it. So the author, I just happened to look it up. It was published this year. The last name is Martinez Hernandez, and David Martinez Hernandez, and that was in the Strength and Conditioning Journal. Like I said, it's definitely something that needs to be explored. I will say that the king of flywheel research right now is Marco Beto, and there's a lot of questions that still need to be answered, and specifically things like how does flywheel training compare to other methods of training?
Mhm.
And there's been a couple studies out there, but again, it's hard to monitor eccentrics in general. It's really hard to monitor some of the flywheel
Yeah.
stuff as well.
No one rep will look the same.
Correct.
That's something that when I first got on, it's different. It's a different loading system to what people are used to. Now, again, it also depends on if you've got the harness or the belt. But
Hmm.
even that, like your body position to catch, will be different to if you were doing a barbell squat or a dumbbell kettlebell squat. It's unique, very unique.
Yeah, definitely.
When we talk about sort of plyometrics and the ability to explode, one thing that I took away from the Switzerland conference that we were both at was the the clean jump um, derivative that you introduced. Well, Paul did, but he said you were the credit one for that. So can you break it down a little bit and sort of tie it into what we spoke about previously in the weightlifting derivatives.
Yeah, so a jump shrug is very unique in that you could probably classify it as a weightlifting pulling derivative because of the similar movement mechanics. But you could also classify it as a loaded jump. And so, what's unique about the movement in general is that compared to other loaded jumps, it obviously has a hip hinge movement. So, you're less straight vertical when it comes to a counter movement because you're going to scoop the hips under um, when you perform that movement. But typically, you're going to use that with really light loads as you would most loaded jumps in general, but it also possesses very unique um, force force time and force velocity characteristics. So, compared to our standard jumps that we think of with a loaded jump, our hex bar jumps, our jump squats, we actually did a study on this and compared the jump shrug to those two exercises. And what we ended up finding was that the jump shrug itself uh, produced it produced higher forces at peak power compared to the hex bar jump and the jump squat at the exact same loads. However, the hex bar and jump squat produced higher velocities at peak power compared to the jump shrug. So you could make the argument that a jump shrug is a more force dominant derivative. But what I will tell you is that as the loads get heavier with a jump shrug, you start to lose those characteristics a little bit, primarily because the hip hinge is more difficult to perform compared to a counter movement that is strictly vertical. Now, how this kind of fits on this spectrum of jumps, loaded jumps, plyometric exercises, is that you know if we're using a jump shrug compared to a go to the extreme like a drop jump, the time of the stretch shortening cycle is going to be significantly longer for a jump shrug. And that has to do with the fact of the length of time it takes to perform the hip hinge movement versus the rapid stretch shortening cycle that occurs during a drop jump. However, they do kind of fit on a spectrum of your speed strength exercises versus strength speed exercises within that context. Now, if I were comparing a jump shrug compared to something like a mid thigh pull or a counter movement shrug, then I would classify the jump shrug as more speed strength compared to a counter movement shrug as a strength speed exercise. So um, they all fit on this much grander
Mm.
force velocity curve that exists. So the fact of the matter is, weightlifting movements are faster than your traditional resistance training movements, like your squat, press, pull. Loaded jumps are going to be faster than your weightlifting movements. Unloaded jumps are going to be faster than loaded jumps. Loaded sprints faster than unloaded jumps, and then unloaded sprinting is faster than loaded
That's
sprinting.
crazy. Yep.
Yeah, so again, it just becomes an entire spectrum that we can use as tools in our toolbox to train the athlete.
I think this is a very important thing that you've brought up, and in the field you can be very tied down to one specific method and one specific principle. But what you've just described is sort of going from the slowest slow that you can go, so like a heavy 1RM or loaded eccentrics, and then build it up to unloaded sprints, and so really using that whole force curve. The way that people get tied down in these is it's kind of limiting to what their athletes can do. And I think the importance that you place on this practical sense of your methodologies and your applications to your athletes. Do you think that neglecting everything else and just going solely focus on one that hinders your athletes more on their whole performance?
I think by I mean the collective research definitely suggests that we should be using a combination of one end of the spectrum versus the other end of the spectrum. So in this case, we'll just say a force or velocity emphasis. However, how we divvy that up is going to be based on, again, what the athlete needs. So within the needs analysis for the actual athlete, are they going to be more that strength speed person or more that speed strength person? And, the percentage that we kind of modify their training with is going to be unique to that individual. The problem that we often face is that individuals, um, strength and conditioning coaches, and I'm guilty of it too, working with variety of athletes, you get comfortable in being able to create the same program for every single person. Now, again, we're all going to have our bread and butter exercises.
Hmm.
But the reality is,
RDLs.
yeah, yeah. I mean, 90% or 80 to 90% of the programs that we develop may be used with almost any athlete that we have. However, that other 10 to 20%, depending on the level of athlete you have, et cetera, is what's going to be very unique to that individual, because we still need to develop those maximal strength characteristics that serve as our um, underpinning characteristics for other abilities. We'll say that strength is the foundation upon which other abilities are built. And just ask Mike Stone; he's been doing it for years.
Hmm.
But when you start to add in, that 10 to 20% of that other programming, it becomes very unique. And I think that's where you can get um, those adaptations, provided that that you've done it in a progressive manner, building them up to what you would like them to achieve. But what I would also say, and we kind of mentioned this before, is that you're not going to get better at sprinting unless you sprint. You're not
Hmm.
going to get better at changing direction until you change direction. So, despite focusing on these things, whether it's the weight room or the pitch or wherever you're working on these things, they still need to practice the skill itself. And this kind of comes down to each individual skill being very specific in terms of the strength characteristics that it needs. So, I define strength as the ability to produce force against an external resistance within a task specific context. So, the task specific context is a skill. It can be sprinting, it can be change of direction, it can be squatting, it can be a weightlifting movement, but all of those require very task specific strength, not sport specific strength. Task specific strength and sport specific strength can be very
Bit
different
different.
depending
Yeah.
on what we're talking about.
Yeah. I've recently got some slack at dinner based on our previous conversation about sprinting and its link to plyometric exercises.
Mm.
The person I was at dinner with was very much that is not an extension or anywhere related to plyometrics. And we kind of had to agree to disagree on that one. But can you talk about the link between sprinting, although they are very two different exercises, but they are still linked in the terms of shortening cycle of it.
Sure. I mean, I would first make the argument that plyometrics in general, the way that we think about them with the training studies and everything that are out there, a lot of the, and I'm putting quotes, plyometrics are not actually plyometrics. It's
Hmm.
jump training.
Yep.
And part of that comes down to the length of time of the actual stretch shortening cycle that takes place. So there's a good paper that came out earlier this year, not too long ago, that was actually going through and defining what a fast and slow stretch shortening cycle actually was. And the standard that we've been thinking about for a long time was roughly 250 milliseconds. This group actually showed that it might actually be shorter than that. But anyway, that as part of this conversation, um, if we consider a fast stretch shortening cycle to be less than that 250 milliseconds or whatever number it was, um, elite sprinting, they are on the ground for about 90 milliseconds. So you can't tell me that that movement is not plyometric in the sense that there is a eccentric phase, there's kind of the load acceptance of the amortization or isometric phase, and then the propulsion phase, because they're on the ground for a minimal amount of time. Because if they're on the ground any longer, they may actually be slowing down. Why the transfer, like plyometric exercises may relate to sprinting, and I would again classify sprinting as a plyometric exercise just because of how short the movement is. There's again not necessarily going to be direct transfer because of the tasks that you are performing. Just because someone performs a bound really well doesn't necessarily mean that they're going to be sprinting really well, although mechanics are, can be somewhat similar. Um, but that being said, you still have to perform the skill itself, which is actually sprinting, going through the acceleration phase, going through the transition and the max velocity phases. Um, but yeah, I don't think you can separate the two based
Mhm.
on the characteristics that actually relate with
Define it.
both of them.
Yeah. Yeah. You also brought up a good point when we were talking about plyometrics and the development of power, and it's the depth jump considerations behind time under, like the time it takes from you to jump off, bounce, and then jump up again. Can you describe like the way that the height impacts the way that we look at that as a RSI and how that sort of associates with it?
Sure. Yeah, there's been a fair bit of research looking at what they would call an optimal drop height for people during drop jumps. Um, for the listeners, we're constantly battling our proprioceptors when it comes to stretch shortening cycle. So typically, you get two different signals that are going to be battling each other. Our muscle spindles within the muscle bellies are going to be telling our muscle to contract when they feel a stretch or a rapid rate of stretch. So it's kind of like if you go when you go to the doctor's office and they do they hit your knee for the reflex
The
test. It's a
reflex.
myotactic type type test. Your knee's going to kick, and it's the same as if we're going to jump or telling our muscle, yes, you need to contract so we can jump. However, depending on the height, we may actually or we will be receiving an additional force stimulus that's actually going to the tendon, in this case, the Golgi tendon organs. The Golgi tendon organs actually work as a protective mechanism where if there is too much force that's being generated or felt within the tendon itself, it sends us a signal to actually relax the muscle rather than contract the muscle. So we're constantly in this battle with each individual and their reactive strength abilities is that if they're too high on a box when they step off and land, it may generate too much force for their body to tolerate at that point um, within that short period of time, and they may actually have a longer lag on the ground, so longer ground contact time, which may subsequently also decrease their jump height. It could also increase their jump height if they stay on the ground long enough and actually accept
Mhm.
those forces and then jump. But if we're talking about a drop jump where we're trying to minimize the time on the ground, um, those Golgi tendon organs might fire and then they may tell us, nope, you're not going to jump that high.
What would be some of your advice for new coaches and coaches coming into this industry, and sort of how to tie in all that we've sort of discussed today?
We covered a lot.
Yeah.
But I mean, the first piece of advice I would have is do the basics savagely well. And the reality is, we talked about potentiation complexes, we talked about AEL, we talked about kind of the spectrum of plyometrics a little bit. Um, the reality is, some of the athletes that we work with will never ever need to use potentiation complexes and AEL. It's just a reality, or at least maximal, super maximal AEL. because you can accomplish quite a bit in terms of improving strength characteristics, power output by using very basic methods of training. Example, um, you know, we can use heavy resistance training, traditional loading, and just use jump training or plyometric training, because anyone can use plyometric training at different levels as long as they're prepped for it. But you can improve power output and their strength characteristics quite a bit just from doing those types of things. But then use that as your foundation, and then start to sprinkle in the sexier stuff like your AEL, your potentiation complexes. But again, this comes back to doing the basics savagely well, until you start to see the athlete needing a novel training stimulus to continue to improve. On top of that, I would also say don't isolate training um, to the point where they are not still practicing the actual skill.
Hmm.
Now, the concepts of things like triphasic training, I understand the theory behind it, where you want to focus on the eccentric, you want to focus on the isometric, you want to focus on the concentric movement to emphasize the phases of training for the stretch shortening cycle. There's nothing wrong with that theory. However, what needs to be done is that you still need to practice the actual skill, because otherwise it's going to become very difficult to only perform. Like, you may be really good at the eccentric phase of it, but if you can't pair it with the concentric phase at
Hmm.
all, that's a problem. So again, the other thing I would say is, don't chase ratios. Each individual has a specific profile. They may have a specific dynamic strength index and everything, but it's really important to put it into context and actually relate it back to their sport performance, because they may have, I'm making this up, but a really low dynamic strength index, which means that they need to train ballistically. But if that type of individual is at the top of their
Hmm.
conference performance or nationally and everything, that profile may actually be what makes them good. So if you start messing around with that, you may actually make them worse by training them a certain way. Now, again, it's a guide to training. As long as we put it into context, then it can be beneficial.
Yeah, 100%. And you've just reminded me of one point that you had when you were presenting your at the Swiss conference, and it's that thing of if you don't meet those requirements, you cannot do a specific move. Your particular example was if you don't squat double with your body weight, you can't perform plyometric exercises. Speaking about that, I'm not going to name names, but previously offline I told you about this thing that happened, and that is one thing that that individual said, and I was like, again, Tim is fucking right. Like this does happen in this industry.
Well, and again, I'm giving a talk in an upcoming NSCA conference specifically on athlete testing ratios and force velocity profiles. But to add context to that, the I'll say older literature recommendations have said that for plyometrics, that you have to be able to squat double body weight in order to perform lower body plyometrics. They also said that you needed to be able to bench 1.5 times your body weight to do upper body plyometrics. So within that context, I remember at the Swiss conference, I asked the room how many people could actually do both of those. And I think between both groups, I think there was five. So jokingly, I said, all right, so you five come with me. We're going to go do plyometrics. The rest of you just sit here for the remaining hour. And because if you do plyometrics, your body's going to explode, apparently. So just for everyone listening, when it comes to plyometrics, there is a large scale or spectrum of plyometrics that we can use. Something as simple as a line hop is not going to make someone explode. It's very basic, and you can introduce these things to really young individuals to start learning the basics of how to transition eccentric to concentric. What I would, however, say is that it is really important to develop their ability to tolerate their body mass first. I mean, if you think about kids, kids are jumping off of things all the
Mhm.
time. I have a niece and nephew, and when they were younger, they used to jump off of furniture and land in all sorts of ways. Must be nice to not have real bones. But the idea is they need to be able to stop themselves first. So introducing things at really young age, hop in place, hop to one foot, hop to the other foot, and stop and be able to hold that position is really important, because then when you start to say, okay, we're going to hop twice, we're going to hop three times, we're going to jump from left to right to left to right. These are all things that you can introduce as a progression, but that doesn't necessarily mean that if they can't squat double body weight or do 1.5 times bench press, that they cannot do plyometrics. That's simply not true.
Yeah. No, I did find it fascinating because like there is a lot of like demands that people ask of their athletes, and if you can't do one thing, you can't do this. And it's that whole thing where it all depends. Like I love the word depends because like you're never going to be able to give a yes or no answer to a complex topic like the body and exercising.
Yeah, 100%.
Yeah. I really appreciate you coming back on again, Tim. It's been a pleasure, and appreciate the time that it's taken you to go through some of your research and how in depth and you went and providing applicable um, descriptions of it as well.
Yeah, no worries. Happy to do it.
If you just let everyone know where they can find you and reach out to you.
Yeah, sure. On social media, on X and Instagram, the handle is Dr. T Suchomel. You can see it right here. But obviously, we have our master's program at the University of Pittsburgh, and I should have links on either social media to our ResearchGate page that should have all of our research available. Um, my email should be pretty easily findable, I think, when it comes to searching that out. But yeah, there's a ResearchGate page, and then yeah, email. If you just search myself and University of Pittsburgh, you should be able to find that. So
I'll
if you
also
have
link
questions, I'm happy to provide them.
100%. I'll also give the link in the description to the program and where people can find you.
Perfect.
Thank you so much, Tim. Peace.